Oh yeah, here we go. Port crimes. Do you like that? That's quite clever, I think. The subtle art and exact science of video game porting can be a complete minefield, and we're not entirely sure what it is about the process that so many developers manage to get wrong. Whether it's massive graphical downgrades, bugs and glitches, or an inability to gel properly with a different bit of hardware, there truly have been some stinkers. While there have been a huge number of highly successful ports over the years, there have also been a whole load of awful ones, and either devs have had to patch them within an inch of their lives, or the wonderful modding community have been forced to step in and take matters into their own hands. For this list, we're looking at the absolute worst of the worst when it comes to video game ports, those which should have never seen the light of day, let alone been sold to unwitting consumers for exorbitant amounts of cash. I'm Peter from TripleJump, and here are the 10 worst video game ports of all time. Number 10. Dark Souls PC. When it was released for the Xbox 360 and PS3 in 2011, challenge-hungry gamers rejoiced as finally there was a game that was not only difficult enough to truly test their skills, but that also had an engaging setting, a brilliant atmosphere, and looked stunning in a dark, fantastical sort of way. Naturally then, PC gamers were chomping at the bit to get in on the action themselves, so when a PC port was announced, fans were jubilant. This didn't last very long, however, as when the PC version was released, fans found that From Software had taken their promise of copying the console version a little too literally. The chief complaint was the lack of ability to change any of the game's technical settings, meaning that even those with the most powerful machines were stuck playing Dark Souls at 30 frames per second and a maximum resolution of 720p, despite Full HD becoming the norm for the platform. From Software did address these concerns though, and a number of patches were released in order to assuage the widespread anger. Fortunately, when Dark Souls Remastered came out in 2018, the port was handled much better, allowing players to enjoy all of the action in stunning 4K. I love a happy ending. Number 9. Deadly Premonition Director's Cut PC. Though it has amassed itself a cult following since its original release in 2010, Deadly Premonition isn't exactly the best game in the world. Still, it has its fans, and though critics were hugely divided upon its release, there are an awful lot of people for whom Deadly Premonition will always have a place in their hearts. When the director's cut came out in 2013, however, fans of the game were outraged by the quality of the PC release. Although players were treated to additional content, updated visuals, and a new control system, there were a number of things missing from the PC version that would have been considered standard at the time. Not only had none of the issues from the original game been resolved, but players complained of frequent frame rate fluctuations and an inability to play at anything above 720p. In addition to these problems, players also found that Deadly Premonition: The Director's Cut would frequently crash, and some even reported not even being able to load the game at all. Modders were able to fix some of the problems with the graphics, but overall, the PC port remains fairly shoddy. I hate a sad ending. Number 8. Fallout New Vegas PS3. There's no doubt in anyone's mind that when it comes to churning out brilliant PC titles, Bethesda can very often be relied upon to bring home the bacon. But sadly, Todd Howard and chums have become a bit infamous for serving up subpar versions of good games on consoles.
It just works.
Perhaps the most egregious of these was the PS3 release of Fallout New Vegas, which quickly became notorious for its poor performance. It still had many of the things that made the PC version great, but unfortunately the sheer size of the game caused a lot of players to experience problems. Many reported that as they made more saves and the file got bigger, the game would repeatedly crash and freeze up, and the frame rate would fluctuate horribly. Fallout New Vegas was also full of various glitches, games. So with that, on top of all of the other issues, many players found it to be basically unplayable. According to one of the devs, the problems were caused by the lack of RAM on PS3 consoles, which meant the game was basically trying to run on a system that just wasn't beefy enough to withstand it. This is fair, but we can't help but feel they could have at least tried to optimize it a bit. Number 7. Resident Evil 4 PC. When Resi 4 was released in 2005 for the GameCube, the franchise's fans were overjoyed, and the game received universal critical acclaim. It was praised for everything from its story to its character design and voice acting, something which fans of the original know that Capcom hasn't always nailed.
That was too close. You were almost a Jill sandwich.
You're right.
Unfortunately, those who didn't own a GameCube missed out on all that Resident Evil 4 had to offer, at least in the beginning, but luckily it didn't take long before the game started jumping onto other platforms. The leap to PS2 was made quite successfully, but the PC version didn't fare quite as well. The main criticism of the PC port was the control system, as bafflingly, it didn't have any kind of mouse support. Many players found it was far easier to just hook up a controller than it was to try and play the game with a keyboard. Luckily for PC players, the HD port managed to fix pretty much everything they had to complain about, including its graphical problems, and is now considered one of the best ways to play Resident Evil 4. It's just a shame that, it took 9 years to get there. Number 6. Assassin's Creed Unity PC. In fairness to the PC version of Assassin's Creed Unity, the game was a complete and utter mess no matter what platform you played it on, and yet somehow, PC players still managed to get it worse than everyone else. Aside from the numerous bugs and glitches that saw faces disappearing at will and NPCs zooming about the place with reckless abandon, those who bought the PC version of Assassin's Creed Unity also ended up with a whole host of other issues which basically rendered the game unplayable. In well-populated areas, the frames stuttered heavily, and even in quieter spots, many players found that the game suffered from severely stunted performance, even if they had a half-decent graphics card, as well as an incredibly short draw distance and noticeable pop-in. Underneath all of the launch problems, there was actually a half-decent game with interesting and well-paced missions, good voice acting, and a cool environment, but although Ubisoft did all they could to resolve the issues with post-launch patches, it's still regarded as a complete and utter embarrassment to the franchise. I suppose they're just lucky that Steam refunds weren't a thing at that point. My god, the bill would have been humongous. Number 5. Batman Arkham Knight PC. The Batman Arkham series has been delighting DC Comics fans ever since 2009, when Rocksteady's brilliant Arkham Asylum was unleashed upon the world. Though there has been some fluctuation in how well each game has been received, overall the series has been met with critical acclaim. That was until the PC version of Arkham Knight was released, because while the console editions landed somewhere in the mid to high 80s on the review score scale, the PC version ended up doing pretty poorly by comparison. Shortly after the game's release in 2015, players took to Steam and bombarded it with negative reviews. Amongst the complaints were the poor frame rate, which was allegedly capped at 30 FPS, though ended up being much lower at several points throughout the runtime, low-resolution textures, performance issues present on even the most high-end of graphics cards, and frequent crashing. The game was pulled from sale for a time whilst the problems were fixed, with Warner Bros. Offering refunds to anyone who was unhappy with their purchase. When it did finally go back on sale, patched to the nines, there was some improvement, though players did still come across numerous technical issues. What a joker of a launch, eh? A joke, you know, like from the DC comic. Number 4, Devil May Cry 3 PC. 2005 was a brilliant year in gaming, with the likes of God of War, Psychonauts, and Shadow of the Colossus all seeing releases. Among the greats was Devil May Cry 3, a prequel to the original Devil May Cry, which tells the story of the dysfunctional relationship between everyone's favourite brooding blonde Dante and his brother Virgil. The original PS2 release was critically acclaimed, and received widespread praise for its customization options, gameplay, and musical score, amongst other things. Rather than developing and publishing a PC port themselves, however, Capcom decided to outsource the whole endeavour to Source Next and Ubisoft, who were both also responsible for Resident Evil 4's aforementioned sloppy jump to Windows. Players of the DMC3 port found problems with the game engine, which was thought to be underpowered, the ropey controls, and frame rate issues that were somehow tied to the music and menu sounds, which players would have to manually delete in order for the game to run correctly. Add into the mix the fact that they were unable to save the game, which was a no-no considering the main story took most players in excess of 12 hours to complete, and you've got yourself one hot mess of a port. Number 3. Street Fighter II ZX Spectrum. There are a number of questions surrounding the Street Fighter II ZX Spectrum port, but chief among them is why? Or more specifically, why did anyone think it was a good idea to port this arcade classic to a 10-year-old console with approximately the same processing power as your average potato? It bodes well for a game when the first thing it does is point out the technical limitations of the console, but even with that expectation set, players were still hugely disappointed. The machine was simply unable to keep up with the rapid gameplay of the Street Fighter franchise, so rather than getting a fast-paced beat-em-up, players ended up with a pale imitation of a beloved game. The monochromatic graphics meant it was practically impossible to see what was going on, and even if you could make out what was happening on screen, it didn't really matter because the controls were so unresponsive, it was practically unplayable. To add insult to injury, the ZX Spectrum relied on cassette tape-like cartridges, so every time you wanted to play a different fighter, you couldn't just select them on the menu, you had to fast forward to the one you actually wanted. Thank the universe we don't still have to do that. Imagine getting through the Smash Bros roster, Jesus Christ. Number 2. Tom Clancy's Splinter Cell Double Agent, PC. Oh look everyone, it's Ubisoft back once again to butcher yet another port. At this point, I think it's time to lay down the law and just flat out ban them from porting games in the future. What? What do you mean I don't have that kind of power? Oh shut up, you're fired. What do you mean I don't have the power to fire you either? In fairness to the Splinter Cell series, the earlier titles managed to make the leap from console to PC reasonably unscathed. However, for reasons unknown, that all changed when it got to Double Agent. Whilst console players ended up with a relatively good game, PC gamers got stuck with a title that crashed constantly, whose controls and sound didn't work half the time, and one that was filled to the brim with bugs and glitches. The PC edition was also notorious for its lighting not working properly, which under normal circumstances would certainly be annoying but probably not a deal breaker, but in a game that relied heavily on stealth, it did somewhat ruin things for everyone. Look, we're not asking for much, Ubisoft, but please can you at least act like you care about PC players? Please and thank you. And number 1, Pac-Man, Atari 2600. We couldn't possibly have given the number 1 spot to anything but a port that was partially responsible for almost killing the video games industry entirely in the early 1980s. That's right, kids. The Pac-Man port for the Atari 2600 was so bad that it's cited as being one of the titles, alongside of course E.T. the Extraterrestrial, that caused the industry crash of 1983, leading to the bankruptcy of several companies. The majority of the port's problems came down to the limitations of the Atari 2600 console. Players had been used to experiencing Pac-Man on arcade machines, which had much higher technical specifications than home consoles. Developer Todd Fry did his absolute best to recreate the game for the 2600, but he was given less than 6 months to complete the project, so the game could be on shelves in time for the first quarter of 1982. He was also given no specs for the arcade game, and ended up developing the port based solely on his experiences of playing it. Try as he did, the game was a complete shambles, downgraded from the arcade cabinet in pretty much every imaginable way. The mazes were simplified, the little pellets became rectangles, and because the console could only support 2 moving characters at once, the first being Pac-Man himself, the ghosts each only appeared once every 4 frames, leading to this flickering mess. Despite all of this though, the game actually sold pretty well. It just horribly shook consumers' confidence in the games industry, and it was years before audiences had faith in it again.